After the success of the Genesis, Sega tried time and time again to keep that spark alive. The Sega CD was released in late 1992 and the 32X followed in 1994. They were simply add-ons to the Genesis, but Sega pushed them as the hottest new thing to hit the gaming world. Unfortunately for them, we knew better. While the Genesis went on to sell right around 40 million units, the Sega CD only sold 2.7 million, which isn't horrible, especially when compared to the 32X, selling only a little more than 600,000 units. This brought us to the Sega Saturn era, which was set to compete head-to-head with the 32-bit Sony PlayStation. Despite Sega's failures, I actually still had hope for the Saturn. I mean, Sony was a powerhouse of a company, but I thought to myself, what the hell do they know about making a video game console? So I chose the Saturn over the PlayStation upon their release. Boy, what a stupid move. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the Saturn, but back in 1995, it wasn't the cool console to have. Some people blamed the technical limitations of the Saturn for its downfall, but anybody that owned one back in the mid-90s knew that it simply came down to games. I would go to Blockbuster to rent a game and there'd be row after row of PlayStation games and a small little section of Saturn titles. This was due to the fact that the console was hard to program for and Sega burned some bridges over the years with certain game developers. Needless to say, Sony won its first console war and the Saturn was discontinued only 3 years after its release. To be fair, it did a lot better in Japan than it did in North America, but still only sold 9.5 million copies to Sony's 102. Yes, 102 million copies. Sega quickly went back to the drawing board to start work on a new console. And on 9/9/99, the Sega Dreamcast hit North America with a price tag of $199. During this time, the Dreamcast was the most sophisticated home console on the market. The graphics were stunning, the games were good, and the product was flying off of store shelves. In fact, Sega sold over 225,000 units within the first 24 hours of its release in North America, and within a few weeks they'd already pushed out 500,000 consoles. The actual console was a bit smaller than previous ventures. It also came in a very light off-white color, which we hadn't seen from a Sega console in North America. It was the first console released that was able to connect to the internet right out of the box. It featured a 56K modem, which at the time was impressive. The controller looked a bit strange to some, but those of us that owned a Nintendo 64 weren't fazed one bit. In fact, the controller kind of resembled the Saturn 3D controller that was designed for Nights into Dreams. The middle of the controller features a window that looks through to a slot for the Visual Memory Unit, or VMU. These were the console's memory cards. They featured a small LCD screen that displayed text like game titles, but could also be used on specific titles for minigames. The Saturn never had a proper Sonic release, and he was the company's mascot. Sega didn't want to make the same mistake on the Dreamcast, so Sonic Adventure was born. An open-world 3D Sonic game similar in style to Mario 64 for the Nintendo 64. The game boasted amazing visuals, a truly classic soundtrack, and most importantly, fun. The game was just fun to play. It's still fun to play. Sonic Adventure sold a lot of people on the Dreamcast by showing off what this amazing console could do. Games like Jet Grind Radio showed diversity and creativity. One of the first games to use cell shading, the game features a very colorful, almost comic book style to its visuals. Pair this with a wonderful game engine and engaging story, and it's no wonder the game was such a success. Who doesn't want to skate around a modern-day Tokyo, tagging up the city while listening to anything from hip-hop to dance music? Toy Commander was a cool little game where you take control of a boy named Andy and his new toy collection. You'll perform different tasks throughout the house while manning vehicles like planes and race cars. Essentially, you are playing as Andy, who's playing with his toys, but in his imagination, he isn't actually present. This was just another Dreamcast title that showed off the diversity of the console and proved that the Dreamcast could be fun for all ages. Perhaps one of the most innovative and well-known games for the console, Shenmue was developed with a cost of $70 million. This game takes place in 1986. You play as Ryo Hazuki, who's on a mission for revenge after his father's killed. You'll spend most of your time wandering around town, talking to people, looking for clues. You can go just about anywhere. You can play mini-games and even play some old SEGA arcade classics at the arcade. There's lots of audio dialogue, and while plenty of it sounds cheesy, it adds to the game's charm.
Excuse me, do you know anywhere that sailors are likely to gather?
How do you expect me to know something like that?
I'm sorry.
The game's day and night cycle, as well as the weather system, was innovative, and the little things you could do, like buying these little figurines from toy machines or petting a puppy, was just plain impressive. The amount of freedom was just something we hadn't seen much of yet. Honestly, there's so much to this game, I could easily make a 20-minute video dedicated to it. Everybody needs to play this game at least once in their life.
I see the town at night. I see turmoil and conflict. Take care that you do not become involved.
Along with innovative and creative games filled with open worlds, adventure, and criminal activity, the Dreamcast came with some fighting games. Okay, not some fighting games. The Dreamcast is like the fighting game console. For me, this was the best part of owning a Dreamcast. Street Fighter III was that sequel that all of us hardcore fighting game fans had been waiting for many years. This game seriously represents a new day in the series. Only a few familiar faces made the cut, everybody else is new. But if you've played a Street Fighter in the past, it's easy to pick up and figure out just about any of these new characters with little to no time at all. I remember buying this title at EB Games shortly after its release and being simply blown away with the visuals. This game looks fantastic, and I can honestly say it will never get old. I'll be playing this game when I'm 90. The Marvel vs. Capcom series was honestly something I could have never predicted. I mean, I loved X-Men, I loved Street Fighter, and here they were together on my Dreamcast. I mentioned how good Street Fighter III looked on the Dreamcast. Well, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 looks even better. This was right around the time that Capcom started experimenting with 3D backgrounds in 2D fighting games, and I've got to say, they pulled it off well. This is a must-have fighter for any fighting game fan. As much as I love the last two games, this one definitely takes the cake for me. I grew up a huge Fatal Fury fan, probably as much as I liked Street Fighter. Not in my wildest dreams could I have pictured a game where Terry Bogard could take on Ken, or Zangief and Raiden could become an unstoppable tag team. This was the greatest thing to happen to a fighting game, and it was taking place on the SEGA Dreamcast. This game has a very Capcom feel as far as the visuals go, but it feels like they found a very nice medium for the gameplay. The character sprites look great, but even better looking are the backgrounds. I have to say I actually prefer the level designs in this version over the sequel. This game just played like perfection on the Dreamcast, and I wasted hours upon hours of my teenage years with this one. And who could forget the King of Fighters series? I've been following it since its original release and have always been a bit bitter that I never got my hands on a Neo Geo. King of Fighters 2002 is stacked full of playable characters and features that infamous grimy and gritty SNK look. Pair this with their trademark over-the-top Japanese sound effects and it's clear why I wasted hours playing this game. The Dreamcast wasn't only known for its fighters, this console featured a lot of incredible sports titles. Sega and EA weren't on great terms at the time, so That meant no NBA Live, no NFL Madden, but that didn't stop Sega. Instead, the 2K series was born. The NBA and NFL 2K series helped propel Sega Sports into the next gen, and sports gamers had to have the Dreamcast. In fact, most of my friends that had the Dreamcast bought it specifically for sports titles. This led to a special edition Sega Sports Dreamcast model, which featured an all-black exterior and a Sega Sports logo smack dab in the center of the console. I still want one of these. Another genre the Dreamcast did a damn good job at is another one of my favorites, the racing game. Daytona USA was one of my favorite racers for the Saturn. Well, let's face it, there weren't many options on that console, but that doesn't take anything away from this series. Daytona USA for the Dreamcast features all the tracks from the previous 2 titles as well as 3 new ones. The graphics have been revamped and they look great. The driving physics don't remain the same as they were in previous titles, which, depending on who you are, is either a good or bad thing. Nevertheless, I've had a great amount of fun with this title over the years. Another great Saturn title that I still play to this day saw a sequel here on the Dreamcast. SEGA Rally 2 was released shortly after the console hit shelves and really satisfied fans of the series. My first impression of this game was how stunning the graphics were. It just runs so smoothly. In fact, that's something I noticed about almost all of the Dreamcast titles back then. This game has a huge fan following and is a must-have for racing game fans. There was really such a great selection of racing titles on this console. Some of them exclusive to the Dreamcast, some of them multi-platform, but most of them impressed me and many other racing fanatics. And if traditional racing games aren't your thing, you can always pick up the addicting Crazy Taxi. And Crazy sums it up perfectly. You race around town picking up fares and getting them to their destination within the time limit. It seems like a simple concept, but you'll constantly be trying to outdo your last run. I always felt like this was one of the most impressive games on the console visually, and there's nothing like flying around the Bay Area blasting Offspring. The game spawned a sequel, and honestly, it's a great game, but for me, the magic is in the original. Both are a must-own for Dreamcast collectors. So what really made the Dreamcast so great? Well, it looked cool, it was compact, had a cool controller, and featured a lot of cool games. It was pretty quick too. It showed us that you didn't have to wait an hour for a load screen. I mean, going from the PlayStation 1 to this thing was like night and day. This really was a great console. So why was it Sega's last console? I honestly believe if the Dreamcast was released a few years earlier, it would have been a lot more successful. The lack of third-party support didn't help either, but ultimately I think it comes down to 2 main factors. There was no anti-piracy security on the console, so a lot of people figured, why would I go buy a game? I could just rent one from Blockbuster or borrow one from my friend and just burn my own copy of it. That couldn't have been good for business. And the other reason would be the PlayStation 2. It was released less than a year after the Dreamcast, and let's face it, it was more powerful and it came with a DVD player. The PlayStation 2 also featured better graphics, more third-party support, and a lot of first-party titles that they spent years building up on the PlayStation 1 had sequels coming out for the PlayStation 2. Ultimately, prices of the Dreamcast were slashed and retailers were pretty much giving them away at one point. In March of 2001, the Dreamcast was officially discontinued. After this, Sega stepped away from the hardware market permanently. The Dreamcast did sell 10.6 million copies, but ultimately it wasn't enough to be profitable. I still feel that the Dreamcast was a very important piece of gaming history. I mean, I still play mine quite frequently. I've definitely gotten my money's worth. If you haven't had a chance to play one or you don't own one, I definitely recommend picking one up. They're pretty cheap still. Well, that's all for today's episode. Let me know what some of your guys' favorite games were. Leave me some comments, leave me some likes. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more videos coming soon.